In the pitch-black abyss of the Solomon Islands, where the water is thick with oil and the shadows of oceanic whitetips, one man, stripped naked, tied a rope around his waist and told 15 dying sailors the most terrifying words they would ever hear. "Just tell me if I'm going the right way." The water in the Solomon Islands does not just hold the heat of the tropical sun. It holds the weight of 20,000 souls and the twisted steel of over 100 sunken warships. They call this stretch of the Pacific Ironbottom Sound. It is a place where the line between the sky and the sea evaporates at night, leaving you suspended in a predatory void. On the night of September 5th, 1942, that void was filled with the smell of burning diesel and the rhythmic, terrifying splash of things moving just beneath the surface. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the darkness. It was a moonless night, inky black, and choked with a low tropical haze that obscured every landmark. For the crew of the USS Gregory, a small converted First World War destroyer, the darkness was supposed to be their shield. They were returning from Tulagi after delivering marine raiders to the blood-stained beaches of Savo Island. They were moving at 10 knots, ghosting through the channel, hoping the Japanese wouldn't notice a ship that had been stripped of its heavy guns to make room for troop boats. But at 12:56 a.m., the world turned white. A patrolling American pilot, high above the Sound, saw flashes of gunfire on the horizon. He thought he was looking at Japanese submarines. In a tragic attempt to help, he dropped a string of 5 high-intensity magnesium flares directly over the Gregory and her sister ship, the Little. In an instant, the 2 American ships were silhouetted against the blackness, glowing like targets in a shooting gallery. 3 Japanese destroyers, the Udachi, the Hatsuyuki, and the Murakumo, were waiting. They didn't miss. The bombardment was so violent that it was over in 3 minutes. The Gregory's boilers burst, flooding the ship with superheated steam. The mess decks, where the ship's cooks and attendants worked, became a mass of flames. Lieutenant Commander Harry Bauer, though mortally wounded, gave the order to abandon ship. As the men rolled into the oily water, the Japanese destroyers did something that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. They didn't just sink the ship. They turned their searchlights and machine guns on the men floating in the water. Among those survivors was a 22-year-old black mess attendant named Charles Jackson French. French was a child of the Jim Crow South, born in Foreman, Arkansas. He had learned to swim in the Red River when he was only 8 years old. The Red River was a place of treacherous currents and water moccasins, a place where a black child wasn't allowed in the public pools and had to master the wild water just to cool off. He was 5 feet 8 inches and 195 pounds, built like a fire plug, with shoulders hardened by years of river swimming and hauling heavy crates in the Navy's galley. In a Navy that saw him only as a sea-going bellhop, he was about to become a savior. In the chaos of the strafing and the screams, French found a life raft. It was a makeshift, overcrowded platform, and by the time he was done pulling men from the oil-slicked water, there were 15 sailors on it. Most of them were badly wounded, matted with grime and oil, their eyes wide with shock. Among them was Ensign Robert Adrian. Adrian had blast fragments in his eyes and injuries to his legs, his vision clouded by pain. Adrian realized the raft was drifting. The current was dragging them toward the shoreline of Guadalcanal. In 1942, that coast was held by Japanese garrisons who were notorious for their treatment of prisoners. Adrian told the men on the raft the hard truth. If they reached those shores, they would be captured, tortured, or executed. That was when French spoke up. He told the ensign he would tow the raft. Adrian looked at the man, then looked at the water. It was teeming with sharks. He told French it was impossible, that he would only be giving himself up to the predators circling them in the dark. French's response was chilling in its simplicity. "I'm not afraid. I'm a strong swimmer, and I'm more afraid of the Japanese than I am of the sharks." French stripped off his waterlogged clothes so they wouldn't drag him down. He asked the sailors to help him tie a rope around his waist. He slipped into the water, a lone, naked man, connected by a single line to 15 souls. His last request to the men on the raft was, "Just keep telling me if I'm going the right way." For the next 6 to 8 hours, Charles Jackson French became a human tugboat. Imagine the sensation. The rope biting into your waist, the weight of 15 grown men, dead weight, resisting every inch of progress.
The salt
hot water burning your eyes, and the thick, suffocating smell of fuel oil in your nostrils. And then there was the silent threat. Ironbottom Sound is home to the Oceanic Whitetip shark. These are not the sharks of the reef. These are the sharks of the deep ocean, opportunistic hunters that follow the scent of blood and vibration. French later admitted he was scared out of himself. At one point, in the absolute darkness of the night, he felt the sandpaper-like skin of a shark brush against his feet. He described the moment with a raw, terrifying honesty. He nearly peed on himself. He froze in the water, trying to surface and float his feet to the top to keep them away from the jaws below. He sat there in the silence, waiting for the bite that would end it. When it didn't come, he thought to himself, "At least the sharks will be quick." He went back to the stroke. He later joked that the sharks didn't want to have scared nigger for lunch, a defense mechanism of humor for a trauma that would eventually break him. He swam through the darkest hour before dawn, the time when the mind begins to fail and the muscles turn to lead. He lunged forward, rhythmic and strong, pulling that metric ton of human cargo against a powerful current. Every so often, he would call back into the dark, "Just say if I'm going right," and from the raft, the wounded men would watch his dark shoulders rise and fall in the oil-slicked water. Their only hope, tied to the waist of a man the Navy wouldn't even let use the same drinking fountain as them back home. When the sun finally began to bleed over the horizon, an American scout aircraft spotted an impossible sight. A lone man, naked and oil-stained, towing a crowded life raft through the open sea. A marine landing craft was dispatched. When they pulled French from the water, he had been swimming for nearly 8 hours. He was so exhausted he could barely stand, his body trembling from the expenditure of energy that defied human physiology. But the rescue wasn't the end of the ordeal. When they arrived at a rest camp, the authorities tried to segregate French. They told him, "You are Coolid boy. You can go over there where the Coolid boys stay." In that moment, the 15 men on the raft, some of them from the deepest parts of the segregated South, stood up. They were covered in oil and grime, looking like wild men. And they told the master-at-arms that French was a member of their crew and he wasn't going anywhere. One sailor from Alabama warned that if anyone tried to take French away, they better be ready to go to general quarters to go to war with all of them. For a few minutes, in the middle of a world at war, the color line simply ceased to exist, erased by the blood and salt of Ironbottom Sound. French's story became a brief sensation. He was featured on war gum, trading cards, and in comic strips. He was called the hero of the Solomons. Ensign Adrian, outraged by the lack of official recognition, went on national radio to tell the world about the mess attendant named French. Adrian recommended him for the Navy Cross, the second highest award for valor. But the Navy of 1942 didn't give the Navy Cross to black mess attendants. Instead, French received a letter of commendation from Admiral Bull Halsey. The letter was a slap in the face. It mistakenly claimed he had only swam for more than 2 hours, effectively erasing 6 hours of his struggle. The reason was buried in naval tradition. Because the ship's white commander had been posthumously awarded the Silver Star, it was considered unprecedented for a subordinate black messman to receive a higher decoration. Charles Jackson French didn't complain. He went back to the fleet, serving on the USS Endicott and the USS Frankfurt, witnessing the invasion of Normandy from the mess decks. He was discharged in 1945, but the war followed him home. He lived the rest of his life with what we now know as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He suffered from depression and alcoholism, his mind likely haunted by the cold water and the shadows of the sharks. He died in 1956 at the age of just 37. His death didn't even merit 2 paragraphs in the local papers. He was buried in a military cemetery in San Diego, a hero in a forgotten grave. For over 60 years, the human tugboat tugboat was a ghost in the archives. It wasn't until the 21st century that the Navy began to correct the record. In 2022, 80 years after the swim, he was posthumously awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. The rescue swimmer training pool in San Diego, the place where the elite are taught to survive the water, now bears his name. And in 2024, the Navy announced that a new Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, DDG-142, would be named the USS Charles J. French. It is a profound irony of history. A man who was once forbidden from swimming in public pools in Arkansas will now have his name etched into a billion-dollar warship that will patrol the world's oceans as a protector. Charles Jackson French didn't just save 15 men that night in Ironbottom Sound. He saved the conscience of a nation, proving that the human spirit recognizes no hierarchy when the rope is tied around your waist and the sharks are closing in. He was the man who swam until the sun came up, and because he did, 15 other men lived to see it.